Welcome to the J.D. Levy & Associates Calibration Point Podcast. Our podcasts are designed to bring a conversational exploration of key topics that we believe will provide value and insight to those serving in the nonprofit sector. We will highlight new developments in the field, latest research, and things we're learning from our own clients that we can share. If there are topics that you would like to see explored, please send them to us through our website at jdlevyassociates.com.
Thank you for joining in to the Calibration Point Podcast today. We want to welcome Liz Tharp, who is not only a friend, but she is the Learning and Impact Officer of the Welborn Baptist Foundation. And she and I have had the pleasure of getting to work together for a lot of years in different hats, and just really excited to have Liz on today. And the topic of today's podcast is evaluation is for everyone. And we mean everyone. And Liz is going to allow us to explore that together and how we can think about evaluation maybe in a little different paradigm, depending on what the nature of your organization is or your role, even as a volunteer within the nonprofit sector. So Liz, thank you for joining us today. I'm super happy to have you. And when you think about evaluation is for everyone, help us get into your mind space. What does that mean to you? And what kind of picture does that paint?
Yeah, great. Great to be with you, Jamie, always. Thanks for having me. It's a great topic because evaluation is for everyone. When I think about evaluation, for me, really, it's about learning and decision-making. Evaluation is just kind of it's a formal term. And so I think can be a little off-putting when we hear the word evaluation. But really, what evaluation boils down to is just looking at data and information in order to plan and make decisions and understand if we're making a difference and things like that. So in that way, I think it is for everyone. When I think about, everyone from board members to executive directors in organizations, staff members, fundraisers, donors, we all need to understand about the change that is happening. That's why we get into nonprofit work and foundation work. We care about change. So in order to understand and be able to communicate that change to others, we really need evaluation.
You mentioned something interesting that while it is totally important, it's often not associated. And that is, you hit a couple key words. Data, for one, which we understand. We have to have information. But then you talked about planning and decision-making. Mm-hmm. And it is interesting that so often evaluation is really viewed as gather the data and let's see if we're making a change, but not viewing it dynamically is what I just heard you say. And that is that's only one part of the evaluation equation, that once we know if there's change, that then has to inform what happens the next day. How do you plan and how do you decision make? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. The use of that data and information is just as important as the, mechanics going through the process of collecting it in the first place. We do tend to, in the nonprofit world, in foundation world, we tend to sometimes compartmentalize evaluation and think, well, that's just what, one person does. We've got someone with that title, or we have hired a third-party firm to come in and evaluate what we're doing. And they hand us a little report, and that's nice. And we unfortunately, a lot of times they'll sit on a shelf, or we're just not really sure what to do with them. So it really is important to take that next step and have conversations around it. I remember an evaluation presenter, a workshop that I attended probably 12 years ago. And I remember her saying a statement that has just stuck with me since then. And she said, evaluation is never a solo sport, should never be a solo sport. And so oftentimes it is, they're really that the knowledge and the learning that comes out of doing surveys or interviews, with our participants in a program or what have you. That information sometimes just remains with an individual or a group of individuals. But what a great opportunity to take that information and equip the board, equip the executive director in telling the story about the change that they're making, the fundraiser who's sitting down with donors and saying, well, you should invest in this because look, here's some change that we can identify that we're helping contribute to. That's powerful. That's really powerful. So I do like to spend a lot of time there myself within our foundation and also in conversations with our grantees about the use of the data. And when I say data, I've got to pause there because we always think of numeric data. And that is very important for sure. But it's just as important to capture stories, narratives. We collect pictures. Our grantees send us videos, things of that nature. That's all data too, in our opinion. We treat it just as we do numeric data.
Well, you addressed a question that I was going to say, and that was that so often in the nonprofit field, we get stuck on, well, this is too sophisticated. Evaluating this program is going to be too complex. And we do get stuck, and I've been guilty of it myself when I was in the field, at thinking about the term data as really being indicative of something complex.
Yeah.
And how do you, and you're starting that, like, how do you help make sure that a grantee, for example, of your foundation doesn't end up with paralysis, but realizes that no, data is multidimensional and accessible?
Absolutely. So, we oftentimes talk about, we ask questions like, can the organization describe to others the change that they're making? And if they can, how are they doing that? Or if they're not, what is available to help them do that? There might be a need for numeric data. For example, if a nonprofit is helping students raise their grade level, raise their reading grade level, test scores, things like that, you're going to need some numeric data because you're going to want to compare test scores over time, or you're going to need to do things like that. But it also might be just as valuable, alone or with the data together, to understand what the teachers are seeing and to interview, what are the teachers seeing in little Johnny, or, what are the changes that they're seeing? We might learn things that we wouldn't learn from the data. Like we might learn that little Johnny is more focused and he's sitting still more. He has less, disruptive behavior, and all those things are predictors of academic success that we're not going to know just from looking at, test scores. So, I would start with asking questions. That's what we do. Organizations can do this internally with themselves, with their board. Can we describe to others the change that we're making? And, do we have data at our fingertips already that help us support, that story of change? And if they don't, then it's time to sit down and start thinking about how do we prioritize that? Sometimes extra funding is needed. Sometimes some expertise is needed, some guidance. Sometimes those things are true, especially for very small organizations that might not have some folks on their staff who have had any experience with these kinds of things. That's very normal. And so, I do need to back up too, though, Jamie, and kind of segue into the role that funders play in helping nonprofits, be able to get the data that they need and tell the stories that they need to, whether that's by a very sophisticated way or a rudimentary way, doesn't matter. We know that funders have long been in this camp of not always supporting nonprofits in this. In fact, in I think about 2015, about half of boards said that they really supported nonprofits using evaluation data in decision making. Okay, that's the study that I'm thinking of was repeated in 2020, and that number is still about half. Wow. So that's not really changing. Also, another data point that's very interesting that I want to share is that about 2/3 of foundations say that their foundation funds evaluation for less than 10% of individual grants.
Wow.
Okay. So, I think that just bears noting, because nonprofits rely on us. They rely on donors. And, I don't have data that would help me understand individual donors and kind of what is the degree that they might designate, to a program or something like that. I think it is a little bit, Jamie, I know you could speak to this all day long, but it probably is a little more difficult for donors to have donors just give funds to operations, and not designate to a program that their heart is tugging at their heartstrings and things like that. So there are some real things that kind of limit and challenge nonprofits from being able to think about evaluation in the first place. Because if it's not prioritized by funders, and donors might inadvertently be kind of limiting their ability to put some funds towards just supplies to do a survey, or get that expert help to come in and help them design what they need to design. That's an issue, right?
Right. And so, a couple of things that you mentioned there. One, I love your point about, so how to get started with evaluation is to ask the question, just what do you see? That's not sophisticated. That's not complicated. That's us saying everybody can see something happening in those that we're serving. What is it? Right. And let's name it, right? And then call it out so we have a picture. The other that you used, and that was the idea of the story of change, which what's interesting there is that so often, and this is your world, not mine, but so often we see through our clients and just in the field that evaluation is done based on almost a predetermined outcome. That an organization says, well, this funder thinks that this is what we should have, or this is just what we think success looks like. And so they start looking for the outcome, the change, the story of change that they think is already determined. But what you're saying is, no, own your own story.
That's right.
And find out what your story of change really is. And then let's figure out how to start evaluating what's already happening.
That's right. Yeah. Organizations need to really start with that. What's that gut check? What's that hunch telling them that is really what they're doing? What is their value? And start with that. That's really the first place to start, is asking that question. Yeah.
And to that point, Liz, if you mentioned individual donors, and if you think from an individual donor hat for a minute, if I understood as a donor that what I'm really doing is helping you complete your story of change, then that's a very different case to make to me for funding evaluation than saying, hey, we need you to fund evaluation and it doesn't look good or feel good. It's just evaluation. But when I can connect the donor to what you're saying, and that is our story of change, and how do we complete that story? Now it's not me saying to the donor, help us fund this evaluation project. It's help us really see and define our story.
That's right.
And that feels very different to a donor than it does having some kind of preset package that they're funding around evaluation.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a phrase that we use quite a bit, to tell the story of change, tell the story of impact. And that's how, as a funder, that's how we construct our evaluation and reporting framework. It's all around telling the story of what happened over the grant period. What were their successes? What were their challenges? We collect that numeric data too, whatever they have.
Right.
But it's also, filled with narratives and quotes and pictures, and could end up being several pages long. But it tells a story in a way that's so much more compelling and complete. Right. We learn so much from them. And also our grantees love them, because then they have a tool, at the end of the day, that they want to go use and have conversations with their boards. Right. That doesn't often happen with just kind of your classic evaluation report.
So you're really being a catalyst for their story.
Yeah, that's at the end of the day, that's what nonprofits need to do. They need to tell their story. They need to help people understand why they should, connect with them, and trying to find those that connect with them, and telling those stories of change really equip them to do that.
So, Liz, I think you just created our bookend. So on the front end, we said evaluations for everyone. And I think as a great jumping off point, what we're saying is evaluations for everyone, go find your story.
That's right.
And evaluation is just a catalyst to completing the story.
That's right. Yeah. And no matter what your role is, if you're a board member, if you're an executive director, you all care about the story.
Right.
If you're a foundation, you care about the story. So yes, if you really center it on that story, that helps drive questions, helps drive planning. It's a great place to start.
And to your point, decision making.
Absolutely. Yes.
Liz, so appreciate you coming on today. Thank you everybody for tuning in to Evaluations for Everyone, and we'll see you next time. And again, Liz, thank you so very much.
Thanks, Jamie.
Thanks for listening to the J.D. Levy & Associates Calibration Point Podcast. If you have comments or ideas for future episodes, please reach out using the contact page on our website, jdlevyassociates.com.